since the first court appearance in January of 2020, the federal government has spent over $400 billion. A lot of that money has left the country. Of course, a lot of that money went to deal with COVID-19, but it's important to remember, I think, that all the claimants involved in this case are just as affected by, in fact, arguably more impacted by COVID-19. Yes, just because the standard of living, I think everybody knows the standard of living on most First Nations communities in Canada, sadly, is below that most Canadians enjoy, and many of these people are living at or near the poverty or below the poverty level. So it seems to me that there has been a prioritization of, say, globalist issues, environmental issues, and things like that, despite all of the quote unquote lip service to First Nations peoples in Canada. There really isn't, in terms of boots on the ground, since 2015 when the Liberals took over.
Adam Soos here for Rebel News. It should come as no surprise that the Liberal Party of Canada goes out of its way to make themselves seem like the pro-Indigenous party in this country. The fact is, the Liberal Party was more intimately involved with residential schools than any other party in Canadian history. Furthermore, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's dad, was also personally involved in the residential schools. So, like I said, we shouldn't be surprised that they're going out of their way to deny their history and make them seem like they've been going to bat for the Indigenous populations of this country all along. But when it comes to walking the walk, we see that is not true. Long-term water boil advisories have not ended significantly or permanently in many communities across this country. Furthermore, the government is still battling in court against numerous residential school survivors seeking reparations for what they went through, asking for reasonable settlements for what they endured. The latest in this long line of litigiousness against Indigenous communities by the Government of Canada is a group in the Young Chief versus Attorney General of Canada case, which includes, under the Attorney General of Canada, there's an et al. Addition that includes the Government of Canada as well as the Government of Alberta here. Leighton Grey has been fighting on this case and trying to seek just settlements for these communities who endured unbelievable hardships in residential schools and afterwards within Catholic schools. I'm going to be joined in just a moment by Leighton Grey for an update on the government's hesitancy to do the right thing for Indigenous communities.
This is another situation where, in the recent throne speech, the government of Canada, and in fact, despite having now our country having an Indigenous Governor General, government of Canada virtue signaling about respect for Indigenous peoples and truth and reconciliation. As you visit First Nations communities throughout Canada, especially I can speak about here in Alberta, you don't see a lot of change. And this is another example where we had filed a claim. It's in the nature of an Indian residential school claim back in 2019. This is on behalf of a group of people who are part of Kihiwan Cree Nation, which is about 2.5 hours northeast of Edmonton, near the town of Bonnyville. Essentially, what occurred in this case was that there had been previously an Indian residential day school that was run by the federal government up until the early 1970s. When in the early 1970s, the federal government closed that down and there was no school on reserve. And so the Alberta government and the federal government got together and decided that they were going to bus all these students into Bonnyville, where they were made to attend a Catholic school. Unfortunately, at that school, they encountered a lot of the same types of abuses that they'd suffered at residential school on reserve, and added to the mixture, they were there with a lot of students who are part of the non-Aboriginal population who weren't very happy about them being there. And so they suffered a lot of the physical and emotional, cultural abuses that we've come to know through the Truth and Reconciliation report and commission, and through the the class action, the well-known class action.
Mhm.
What's troubling about this case, Adam, is that it was filed back in 2019, was served on the Government of Canada, Government of Alberta, and also on the local Catholic diocese. And apart from the appointment of a case management judge in the Court of Queen's Bench and one court appearance in January of 2020, right before the pandemic hit, really nothing has happened despite our best efforts. And it's a class action, which means that the next stage of things after we sue is certification. And then what tends to happen with class actions is once you get through the certification stage, you get into serious negotiation discussions. Class actions almost never go to a full-blown trial. And what we're dealing with here are the lawyers for the Government of Canada and the Government of Alberta, for that matter, really dragging their feet. In fact, I sent them an email about a month ago indicating to them that unless things could get moving, I would have no alternative but to make a public press release saying what I'm saying now. And what I'm hoping will happen is that some pressure will be brought to bear upon the Government of Canada, the Government of Alberta, to finally address the issues that are being faced by these survivors, many of whom, it's important to remember, are elderly. They had attended these schools back in the early 1970s and 1980s, and they've been living through COVID. And it's possible that some of them have, actually become sick and perhaps even died in the meantime. There are about between 400 and 600 potential claimants, we think, under this case. And so it does have the potential to be a multi-million-dollar claim. And it's entirely possible that's the reason why we're not able to get this thing moving. In fact, I can't even get the lawyers on the other end to even respond to my most recent correspondence.
Well, it's just the latest in a never-ending seeming parade of saying one thing and then doing the other. There are solutions. There are people within these communities. These people are now actively reaching out through you and other lawyers trying to obtain this justice. Is it just more of the same, like Trudeau telling the veteran it's just more than we're able to give right now? Meanwhile, they can seemingly spend on everything else. Like you kind of suggested, does that seem to be the only holdup? Are they at least acknowledging some fault? They seem to talk nonstop and lower flags about residential schools, rightfully so to an extent, but without action, all those symbols mean virtually nothing. What is the holdup here? Is it the money, or is it an acknowledgement of guilt?
I don't think there's any question in my mind that the claims of these people are valid. I think it is, I suspect there is a political decision being made that this is, despite, the public protestations to the contrary surrounding, for example, the school in Kamloops and the new national holiday, the new National Remembrance Day that we have on September 30th of every year, which the Prime Minister observed by going surfing. Yeah. Despite all of that, since the first court appearance in January of 2020, the federal government has spent over $400 billion. A lot of that money has left the country. Of course, a lot of that money went to deal with COVID-19, but it's important to remember, I think, that all the claimants involved in this case are just as affected by, in fact, arguably more impacted by COVID-19. Yes, just because, the standard of living, I think everybody knows, the standard of living on most First Nations communities in Canada, sadly, is below that most Canadians enjoy, and many of these people are living at or near the poverty or below the poverty level. So it seems to me that there has been a prioritization of, say, globalist issues, environmental issues, and things like that, despite all of the quote unquote lip service to First Nations peoples in Canada. There really isn't, in terms of boots on the ground, since 2015 when the Liberals took over. I don't see that the position, the daily lives of First Nations peoples have been significantly improved, despite all of what you described as the virtue signaling of this government.
The other thing that I find absolutely shocking is the issues people get upset about right now. Because correct me if I'm wrong, but the focus now is to bring attention to this story, so the government is pressured to act. Ultimately, that would be the emphasis now with releasing a public release. Is that right?
Yes, that's it. I mean, this is very topical in the news. As I said, truth and reconciliation, rightly or wrongly, was one of the main issues that was addressed in the recent throne speech. Even to the neglect of some issues that are of concern to many Canadians, such as the economy. Um, it seems that environmental issues and truth and reconciliation were very high
Mm-hmm.
on the federal government's list of priorities based on the throne speech. And yet, when we get down to sort of ground level, when you're talking about providing redress, specific redress to people who've suffered through past injustices, the kinds that the government is apologizing for, there doesn't seem to be a lot of action. In fact, it's quite the opposite. There seems to be inertia.
Which, and that's the thing I was kind of getting to, which is confusing. So we want to bring attention to this. Why does it seem that these issues out there that have maybe some foreign funding or some activists, for example, and I don't want to get into this thing because this is a separate conversation, the protest against the Coastal GasLink, the Wet'suwet'en protests, 5 out of 6 Wet'suwet'en elected councils have agreed to that. 20 elected First Nations Indigenous councils along the coast, along the trajectory, the vast majority who are elected in agreed to that, but people are outraged over this. Meanwhile, here we literally have what seems to be an open and shut. People were abused in residential schools and then further abused when brought into the Catholic school system. And there's no outrage, there's no reaction to this. Do you think there's an intentional effort to divert towards those ideological and environmental goals? Because it seems like Canadians would be far more focused on, especially with the discovery of the mass graves and some of the things that we know occurred in residential schools, and some of the abuses that these communities endured. This seems to me, for most Canadians, a more evident and glaring issue.
Well, it certainly is more specific to the concerns surrounding Indian residential schools,
Mm-hmm.
and so this, this is alarming. However, it's not unique. Even, for example, some of the class actions that have been settled, claimants are having trouble actually getting their money from the government because part of what the government of Canada did, and I don't think many people realize this, is they paid a huge sum of legal fees out to a very large national law firm, but that firm actually does little or nothing to assist claimants in actually filing their claims and getting paid. And there actually are many lawyers across the country are having to go out and meet with people on reserve and
Mm-hmm.
take down their information so they can file their claims. And then these lawyers have to actually file a claim with the court just to get paid. So that's typical of the level of I would call it contempt
Mm-hmm.
that the federal government is showing towards um, uh, Indigenous people in this country who have suffered these abuses, notwithstanding, the sort of political currency that
Mm-hmm.
the federal government seems to try to generate publicly
Mm-hmm.
by showing these, this virtue signaling show of support for Indigenous people. As I say, that doesn't seem to be translating into real help for people who are suffering in this country.
And the folks out there, unfortunately, a majority of people believe that this government is pro-indigenous. They categorically are not. What often happens is, like you mentioned, these massive national firms that maybe have some friends in government, companies like SNC Laval and some of these other infrastructure companies, that are making millions upon millions, billions, in fact, and collectively, and the water problems are not getting resolved, and they're using the smoke screen of "we dare not look into Indigenous affairs." Well, I can tell you something from the Indigenous communities that I've spoken with. They'd welcome a little bit of intrusion into their privacy for clean drinking water. I can assure you the mothers who cannot bathe their children because the water is toxic would welcome that. And these families who've received nothing after enduring residential schools, many of whom are at the end of their lives, would like to see some resolution and some justice carried out, and the government of Canada do the right thing before their time on this planet passes on. Finally, what can people do to help get the message out, to help hold the government accountable, and to ensure that these people receive some just settlement and have their day in court if that is not the case in a timely fashion?
Well, if people are genuinely concerned about the interests of people, for example, of the Indigenous people who are part of this claim, who are from Kihiwan, who are fellow Albertans, they can certainly register their concern with their local MPs or MLAs so that perhaps it can be brought into question period and brought up in the legislature or in the House of Commons. That would be useful. But I think more than anything else, I would like to see Canadians become more questioning of their government and more aware of what of the, as I say, as you put it, this sort of gap between the rhetoric and what is actually being done to help and to show truth and reconciliation. If the words are true, then the actions towards reconciliation also need to align with that and be truthful and honest. As you say, it's not just water, the infrastructure that exists and the institutions that exist in a lot of our First Nations communities. When you start talking about schools and healthcare and access to basic services, even policing is very, very decrepit and needs to be addressed. And so my main goal with this is to bring awareness to people so that they're not duped into believing this rhetoric that's coming from the federal and provincial governments about truth and reconciliation. There's a lot of work to be done, and I just don't think it's being properly executed on a day-to-day practical level.
Well, I want to thank Leighton for his important work and bringing attention to this important story. When the media often distracts and echoes government talking points, we're focusing on these people who have undergone injustice and are standing up for themselves. We don't want people distracted with side stories and government rhetoric. We want people knowing the truth. We want people having access to these types of stories. So take action, call your MLA, call your MP, let them know that this is happening. Let them know that the government is not responding to survivors of residential schools. As always, I want to thank you all for tuning in. For Rebel News, I'm Adam Soos. Many big corporations and media outlets are profiting and taking money hand over fist from the government under the smokescreen of the Indigenous industries. We find that absolutely appalling. These communities need help, not greedy corporations benefiting from their suffering. Unlike those guys, we don't take a cent from the government. That would undermine our capacity to act as independent voices in an otherwise bought out field of journalism. So if you want to support us, consider subscribing at rebelnews.com, or if you want to represent the brand and get some Rebel gear for you and your friends, you can do so at rebelnewsstore.com. If it's your first order, you can use the code ADAM10 for 10% off.